Hi there, Jonathan here. The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website where you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. That's at www.jonathanfoust.com. Thank you and enjoy. So getting on toward the end of this older man's life, he was feeling rather contrite and self-conscious about his anger and his abusive behavior toward his wife. And as he thought about it, he realized that every time he would have an outburst, never once did she fight back. She would just very calmly get up and leave the room. And he really wanted to kind of make amends, so he was apologizing, for his behavior, just seeing this kind of abusive, destructive behavior. And he said, how did you do that? How did you control your anger? Because you would just calmly get up and leave the room. How'd you do it? And she said, well, if you really want to know, I would get up and I would leave and I would clean the toilet bowl. But, well, how does that help with your anger? And she looked at him and said, well, I used your toothbrush. So we all have different ways of dealing with anger. Some may be more skillful than others. Usually when I have a topic, I have some experience that week. So if I'm going to talk about working with pain, I get a migraine. If I'm talking about working with conflict, there'll be some conflict. And the good news is I didn't have any real big episodes with anger. The bad news is I didn't have anything to talk about. So I emailed some friends, some of my flea-bitten, hardened yogi friends, and I said, give me some examples of anger and how you worked it. So I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about this very powerful weather system that occurs, the weather system of ill will, anger, hatred, blame, and judgment, and talk a little bit about the source of the cause, and a few strategies of how you can work with it when you are visited by this particular weather system. And a little bit about how to work with strong energy when it comes up in your meditation practice or in your life. So I asked a friend to tell me about a time, one of his top 3. And I'll just read a little bit of what he wrote. He says, as trite and common as it is, my greatest anger for some time was with my boss. He's the owner of a large company I worked for 10 years. I don't know if it's the angriest I've ever been, but it ranks right up there. I was angry because I did great things for him and for the company, and he never appreciated it. Odd as it may seem, he didn't even understand or even care to understand what my team did and what I did. And through my cleverness and experience, I brought him year over year incremental 7-figure bottom line earnings. But he was so lost in himself to really get it. And this is a man who had framed testimonials and honors of himself throughout all the corporate offices. And in his office, images of him with presidents and so forth. Not only did he not appreciate it, but he would continually admonish me for obscure, nonsensical things. It seems that my boss was incontrovertibly DSM-5 diagnosable bipolar unmedicated. He really thought about this. He had over 10 years. I didn't know what was worse, his highs or his lows. The only thing that prevented me from quitting on multiple occasions was that when he was angry with me, he would make no sense. And thus I was able to feel a little distance from him. Now, my friend's no stranger to practice, so he knew that anger is something to investigate. And part of the investigation in anger is to look for the unmet need. Because generally, whenever you're caught in that pattern of anger, there is something you're wanting, there's something you're hoping for that's not happening. So he says, what was my unmet need? Validation, gratitude, wanting even a fraction of care from me as an individual. But I don't think all my anger was about an unmet need. Suffering abuse is an addition to an unmet need. So what changed? He said, I'll answer that one with a story. I tried for many years to get over my anger by dismissing him as bipolar. I'd say to myself, he's sick. I must excuse him. But it didn't work. I'd ruminate horribly, and this went on for years. Then, in the middle of a 10-day meditation retreat, I listened to a Dharma talk on forgiveness. Actually, the Buddhist teacher mentioned Christ on the cross, forgiving those putting him to death. While I'm not a Christian, I deeply grasped the value of such an act, regardless of whether it did or didn't happen. So that evening, I went home to my room and I sat, opening myself to all of this. And it came to me to forgive him. I truly forgave him for all of what I believed to be his transgressions. A great weight started to lift. But as it was lifting, I had what I call a superior epiphany. No sooner than my release started, I felt something wasn't true, something was ingenuine. I thought about the concept of forgiveness. Now, there are many definitions and connotations, but to me it meant, I'm going to let you off the hook and not hate you anymore because I'm such a good person. And that's when it hit me. Who the hell am I to forgive him or anyone? I reflect on who I was, some supreme, grandiose benefactor being gracious enough not to hold him in my judgment. And I realized it's not up to me to forgive. It's up to me, for my sake, to accept. And that doesn't mean I must accept enduring verbal abuse or any other such things. But it does mean that I should accept people as they are. And then I can start to feel more compassion. It was my acceptance of what is, more than forgiveness, that dramatically reduced my ruminations and my suffering. And a year later, as I meticulously planned, I resigned with grace and as a good Machiavellian with a bonus. And the answer for me was loving what is, no matter what. And if you aren't loving it, liking it, finding it endurable, you can't get from here to there. Anger and ego are both intertwined. So it's an interesting arc of writing anger. Imagine each of us have felt that affront at different times when we feel ourselves caught. So when you think about your top three, in fact, we'll just do a little reflection. If you like, you can close your eyes. When you think about the times when you've been most angry, you might take a few minutes and kind of go through the files. When you have experienced anger, what did it feel like on the inside? Can you connect with the energetic experience of anger? Just in your own way, saying hello to that energy system that occurs when you're angry. And if you'd like, you can let your eyes open, or you can remain with them closed. When you are in the weather system of anger, physically your heart rate increases. There's arterial tension. There's testosterone production begins to increase. Cortisol decreases. And the left hemisphere of the brain gets more stimulated. Another friend who wrote me about his anger, because I asked him to describe what did it feel like inside? What's the subjective experience of anger for you? And he described a conflict he had with his wife. And he said, it felt like metallic acid burning in my gut, tension in my neck muscles, a clenching my teeth in my sleep, and endless pictures going through my head of future pain. And it reminded me of a sense of powerlessness as a child, a sense that it wasn't fair, I should have more attention, I should have more things, more nurturing, and a very deep feeling of hurt, and one that spawns endless vibrations of disharmony in my life. Most of us in this culture are frightened by our own anger. And primarily it's the fear of the harm that we might cause when we're overtaken by anger. Anger is an emotion, it's energy in motion. As I like to say, you know how much housework you can get done when you're really pissed. You know, it's a lot of energy moving. So when you're angry, there's a tendency to shut down, to kind of close down. Because your system is going into fight, flight, or freeze. Either it's going to lash out or run away or freeze as a survival mechanism. And when anger isn't fully digested, it can run deeper grooves. And those grooves are our habitual ways of responding. There's a word which I've named before called Samsara, or that's the Vedic term. In Pali, it's Samsara, and they're literally grooves. They're sort of the tracks that you fall into when you have the same conditioned response over and over and over again. And it really kind of correlates to the neural pathways that are associated. So if you're around anger as a kid, you came up with some survival strategy. You may have been the one to fight back, or you may have been the one to run away, or you may have been the one simply to freeze. Those patterns get entrenched. And your own patterns of anger are very predictable. And your own patterns of anger affect everyone around you. So the bad news is that we're all conditioned around anger. And the good news is that we can change the way we relate to anger. And there's some real benefits to this. And in fact, the Buddha outlined 11 benefits from learning how to transform anger into loving kindness. So if you'd like to hear them, they're kind of fun. So as you develop your capacity to transform anger into wise action and into loving kindness, you will sleep happily. You will wake happily. You will experience no evil dreams. You are beloved of men and women. You are beloved of non-humans. You're protected from harm. Your mind is quickly composed. Your complexion is serene. That's a nice one. At the moment of your death, you will pass away unbewildered. And if you can go no further along the path of realization, you will at least be reborn in the heavenly abode of the Brahma Devas. So what's not to like about learning how to transform your relationship to anger? So it's helpful to remember that when anger arises in your life, that there's a cause if you look closer. As I was researching this talk on anger, I was doing a little research on the web, which inevitably took me to YouTube, which inevitably took me to road rage videos. Oh my. I don't know if you've seen them, but there's a whole category of road rage videos that are... I'm still traumatized watching these things. Just, if you want to see naked, unmasked aggression, look no further than road rage videos on YouTube. And I didn't watch that many of them, but I watched a couple of them. And generally there's just a sense of moral outrage toward another person and a deep belief that the other person needs to be punished. And I've shared here my own personal practice of driving as a spiritual practice. I'm not innocent of experiencing anger on the roads. But I remember once, back when I lived in an ashram, and my teacher's teacher, at that time, I had a celibacy vow. And so it was poverty vow and a celibacy vow. And so there was lots of teachings on how to work with that energy. And basically one of the teachings was to see, as a male, to see all women as either mothers or sisters, and to see men as brothers or fathers. And to kind of use that frame to kind of a more wholesome frame. And I remember driving a car and some idiot, kind of cut me off, and I passed her furiously, and at the next stoplight, she pulled up behind me. And I looked in the rearview mirror, and she was a dead ringer from my mother. And it was fascinating to see the anger really turn to shame, that I had made this person kind of an unreal other person. And that's what happens when we're overcome by anger, is we make the other person unreal. We take it all personally. There's a verb we often use in kind of the mindfulness circles as to self or selfing. The act of selfing is when you defend yourself as this individual self against the world. And when you're under threat, it automatically happens. You close yourself off from others. And so the question is, how do we move from seeing others as the enemy to a more empathic relationship? It's always interesting when you see a football game, how these guys who are smashing into each other, at the final bell, many of them hug each other or slap each other in the back. Many of them have played before on different teams. And it's that shift from the perception of the other as enemy to being able to bridge some understanding. Or as the kind of the essence of the teaching is to see self in other and other in self. That's part of the practice. It's that profound distinction that occurs. It's the difference between being angry and being with your anger. As soon as you recognize the state of anger, you've begun to shift something internally. So just as you might say, as I breathe in, I'm aware of breathing in, it's that recognition of, as I breathe in, I am aware of anger. You're no longer as identified with that condition. And rather, you have taken that seat of the observer which allows you to explore it in a very powerful, possibly transformative way. The sense of the witness is such a powerful aspect of the practice. You can be aware of your thoughts. And what's interesting how in meditation, if you ever had the experience in meditation of feeling your body very, very heavy or very, very light, or losing track of time, if that ever occurs for you in meditation, like how long have I been sitting here? Has it been 3 minutes or 20 minutes? You're really actually experiencing the brainwaves of sleep. Because in sleep you lose temporal and spatial awareness, and yet you're aware. If you ever had a dream and you're aware that you're dreaming in that dream, you're aware of the dream state. And that's where these practices point toward. We've identified in the West the waking state, the sleeping state, and the dreaming state. But through the practice of meditation, through these teachings, through looking at consciousness and functional MRIs, looking at consciousness itself, we can really say there's a fourth state of consciousness, which is this consciousness of the witness. You can be aware of your thoughts as you're thinking them. You can actually be aware when you're in the dream state, when you're in the sleep state. And it's possible to be aware and to witness anger when it arises, and to look deeper, to actually investigate that state when it's there. Not easy, but it's possible. When anger arises, it's a very, very powerful energy. And maybe you've noticed when you're hanging out with someone who's angry that it activates you in some way. Sometimes it may activate you into the flight syndrome, where you just want to appease or run away or withdraw. Sometimes it may activate you into freezing, just wait till the storm passes and it'll be okay again. But it might activate you into fighting back. And that's kind of what that energy of anger can do. So I'd like to read a story. This is this is retold from an ancient Buddhist story. And it sort of refers to, I don't even understand the whole thing of the gods and so forth, but oftentimes the gods are referred to as like representatives of different aspects of consciousness. But this is the story of a demon that feeds on anger. Once there lived a demon who had a peculiar diet. He fed on the anger of others. And as his feeding ground was the human world, there was no lack of food for him. He found it quite easy to provoke a family quarrel or national and racial hatred. Even to stir up a war was not very difficult for him. And whenever he succeeded in causing a war, he could properly gorge himself without much further effort, because once a war starts, hate multiplies by its own momentum and affects even normally friendly people. So the demon's food supply became so rich that he sometimes had to restrain himself from overeating, being content with nibbling just a small piece of resentment from close by. But as it often happens with successful people, he became rather overbearing, and one day, when feeling bored, he thought, shouldn't I try this with the gods? On reflection, he chose the heaven of the 33 deities, ruled by the Lord of gods. He knew that only a few of the gods had entirely eliminated the fetters of ill will and aversion, though they were far above the petty selfish quarrels. So by magic power, he transferred himself to that heavenly realm, and he was lucky enough to come at a time when the divine king was absent. There was none in the large audience hall, and without much ado, the demon seated himself on the empty throne, waiting quietly for things to happen, which he hoped would bring him a good feed. Soon some of the gods came into the hall, and at first they could barely believe their own divine eyes when they saw that ugly demon sitting on the throne, squat and grinning. Having recovered from their shock, they started to shout, "You ugly demon, how can you dare sit on the throne? What a crime. You should be thrown headlong into hell and straight in the boiling cauldron. You should be quartered alive." But while these beings were growing more and more angry, the demon was quite pleased because from moment to moment he grew in size, in strength, and in power. The anger he absorbed into his system started to ooze from his body as a smoky, red glowing mist. This evil aura kept the gods at a distance, and their radiance was dimmed. Suddenly a bright glow appeared at the other end of the hall, and it grew into dazzling light from which Saka, the king of gods, emerged. He who had firmly entered the undeflected stream that leads toward nirvana. He was unshaken by what he saw. The smoke screen created by all this anger parted, and he slowly and politely approached the usurper of his throne. "Welcome. Please remain seated. I can take another chair. Would you like a drink? Our Amrita is not bad this year, or would you like something a little stronger?" And as he spoke these friendly words, the demon rapidly shrank to a diminutive size and finally disappeared, trailing behind a whiff of malodorous smoke, which likewise soon dissolved. So that story is, I think, beautifully summed up with a classic line from the Buddha, who said, "Never is hatred stilled by hatred. It will only be stilled by non-hatred. This is an eternal law." So the question becomes, when you experience ill will, aversion, anger, judgment, blame, is it possible to meet it with a different energy? You may recall back in the fall, I gave a talk called How to Keep Your Heart Open During the Election. And before I gave the talk, I said, I'm deeply opinionated, I'm deeply biased, and I'm probably ill-informed. But I kind of launched into my talk, and I got some very strong feedback on that talk. And as you can imagine, it was very slanted toward one particular party. And the feedback that showed up really surprised me, because I thought I had really tempered what I was saying, but I got a lot of anger. And at first I was really defensive. And I thought, I'm just not even going to respond. And then I thought, that's not going to do anything. And so I engaged in some dialogue. And part of it was, I wanted to do the right thing, even though I didn't want to do the right thing, to be honest. And yet, as I engaged into dialogue, I realized that the anger coming at me, that there was an unmet need, and that some of these people were feeling judged. They weren't feeling heard, and they weren't feeling seen, and they weren't feeling respected. And what they needed was to be heard and seen and respected. And it was a very powerful experience for me to really lean in, to really try to understand where some folks who are really on the exact opposite polarity of my opinion, to really give them what they needed, which was also what I needed, to really be deeply informed. So there are a few things to explore when you experience anger, and not uncommon in meditation to just have memories arise that have some form of aversion or anger. And you could say there are two different ways to explore, but one particular way is to remember this acronym that can be very helpful in transforming anything, any strong energy. And the acronym of RAIN, R-A-I-N, to recognize what's happening, to ask yourself if you can allow it, if you can accept it. The I is to investigate what's happening, to lean in. And the N is to nourish what you find with some form of loving presence, with empathy or compassion or kindness. It seems to be the formula, a pretty effective formula. When you recognize anger arising, sometimes naming it can be helpful, just to see it. As the Tibetans say, some things are self-liberating. As soon as you can name it, it may dissipate. Anger tends to be a little stickier. But an important question to ask yourself when you're experiencing anger is really that question of the A in the acronym. Can I allow this? Because with a strong energy like anger, it's important to acknowledge that sometimes you can't. You may feel flooded. There may be too many strong emotional associations. Maybe you don't have the energy to be with it. And as I often say, very strategic decision to let it know you see it. And let it know another time when the conditions are different, that your intention is to have tea with that. But if you do have the sense that you have the non-judging presence, the concentration, the energy, the curiosity, when all those factors are there, then you can do what I call riding the wave. Emotions tend to arise in waves. You're kind of going along, equanimity, things are fine, and then there's the clench. Something unpleasant arises. And then you begin to feel that rising quality of unpleasantness. We're really, really good at getting off the wave. And that's where we will very conveniently, as you feel the wave building, we'll move into one of 5 classic strategies. Either you blow it off into blame, anger, judgment, or you'll disassociate in some way. I'll just go to my happy place, or I'll think about something pleasant. Or you'll get caught in a cycle of worry or restlessness. You won't be able to stay on it. Or you'll pull the plug and lose energy, or get tired, or find yourself spiraling into a depressive cycle. Or you'll have a doubt attack. I can't be with this. This is too much. If you can stay on the wave, you stay with the feeling on the inside. So you actively investigate that whole energetic arising of anger. Again, only if you can be with that. If you have a strong witness and you can really watch the energy rise, generally what happens is it will rise and then it will crest and then something occurs on the other side. And quite often, it's like if you feel a cry coming on. You feel it coming, you be with it, you hold the space for it, and then you feel something rise, and then there's the catharsis, and then there's a release. On the other side of the wave, if you can stay on it, there will either be a sense that some energy system passed through, like a violent thunderstorm passed through, and you may feel a little more clarity. Sometimes there's a sense of ease that occurs on the other side. Sometimes, not always, there may be an insight. There may be some recognition of maybe a memory that might be associated with it, or maybe something you're believing that maybe isn't true. So fundamentally, staying on that wave, staying connected with it energetically is really, really key. There are a few other things you can do. And one is to help you investigate a little bit deeper, is to remember, if you can, that anger is an unmet need. That in that event of anger, there's something you were wanting, something you were hoping for that didn't happen. And that requires some real courage, because that will point you toward what's underneath that display of anger. In my own experience, anger is never just one emotion. There's always some form of disappointment or wanting or shame or revenge. There's all kinds of stuff you can tease out when you experience anger. So looking toward the unmet need inevitably will move you into a more vulnerable place. To really be honest, oh, wow, I was really wanting some acknowledgement there. And I didn't get it. Oh, ouch. It'll point back toward that very, very deep ouch. And then it moves you toward the end part of that equation. Can you meet what you find with some kind of empathy or compassion or kindness? This is part of the journey of becoming more awake and alive, is to acknowledge the disappointments, to acknowledge everything that's between you and feeling free. So another friend recently went through a divorce, a really hard, messy divorce. Working with a mediator, and information wasn't clear. And then finally, the other side had an evaluation on his business that was way beyond its true value. And he told me he was so angry he couldn't see. Have you ever had that experience of blind rage? I've experienced it a few times, where you're so overwhelmed by that rush of energy and emotion that you just can't see. He said he was so enraged, he literally couldn't see straight for a long time. And so how did he get to the other side? And again, he's no stranger to his meditation practice and working with strong energies. He knew that he had to sit with it. And as he would just sit, and as raised a Quaker, we had a phrase we always used: don't just do something, sit there. So he elected to sit with it. And he noticed how he'd ride a wave. He'd just feel that wave of of revenge and hopelessness and sadness and regret, and then calm. And then another surge would come through. And as he sat with it, and again, this isn't necessarily a quick fix, but his insight on the other side, he said, I realized nothing is solid. Anger is not solid. Everything changes. The key for me, he said, was to feel the feeling straight on and face it fully. It takes a huge amount of courage to do that. I think I had shared the story just briefly in our final minutes of a woman who was, she had her 7-year-old daughter had a bunch of other kids over. And they were all just maybe 7 or 8 7-year-old girls. And they were just having a great time, but making a huge amount of noise. They're very, very excited about something. And a lot of as you can imagine. And suddenly she felt this rage coming up. And she was just about to explode. and say, she was just going to scream, "You girls need a timeout." And then something occurred to her, and she said, "Wait a minute, I need a timeout." And she stepped into her bedroom, and she thought, okay, rain, recognize what's happening, trembling, anger, rage. Can I be with it? Yeah, I can allow it. And as she investigated it, she could just see she was feeling out of control. It was just, it was overwhelming for her. She brought to that some empathy, some kindness, a little bit of self-soothing, like it's okay. You're doing this for your daughter. And then she calmed. And that wave of anger sort of passed. And then she was able to go back. And here's the kicker. What the girls were so excited about, they were making a gift for her. Anger has been described as drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. The other analogy is like picking up a hot coal to throw at someone and not realizing that you're the one who's getting burned. So it's a powerful, powerful thing. If you can be skillfully with anger when it arises, to sense what is underneath it, what is the unmet need, and there may be an insight in there. And one of my friends said, as he was reflecting about his story of anger, he said at the end of his email, he said, there's always something under the surface. It reminds me of Ram Dass saying that your demons, when you're young, they're horrible, bloody demons. And they still show up for tea when you're old. They're still hanging around. And as he was describing the anger that he felt toward his wife around an incident, he said, I realized that in the same way that I was closing down toward my wife to punish her, how I did the same thing with my mother. How I would shun her to get her to give in and pay attention to me. And now I really get, it was just a poor little hurt kid wanting to be loved and to love. That's what can be on the other side of anger. It's the willingness to look closely, to see it for what it is, and to sense if you can bring tenderness to find what's underneath it. So that's a little rant on anger. A couple quick announcements. We've got tea and cookies. It's always good to get a little fuel before you head home. Our mindful discussion group will be meeting in the boardroom. Do check it out. It seems like a really, really cool community. Remember, there's yoga before our sessions. You may want to check that as well. And as always, your generosity for the church and for me is deeply appreciated. So may you in your anger and wrath have a wonderful evening together.